A devoted mother is found dead from an apparent suicide.
Her body was in the bathtub. She had died from drowning. There was no other explanation for it.
They found a journal. She had been having some problems with depression.
But her loved ones aren't convinced.
She loved her family. She loved her job. She loved her friends.
Everything she did in her life was take care of her children.
Law enforcement isn't convinced either.
The fact that there was blood in the water, there was frothing in the mouth, I call it homicide. Your body's not going to let you kill yourself drowning in shallow water.
The investigation reveals a possible murder for hire.
A woman told them that her stepfather had hired a hitman to kill someone else.
They said, I need somebody to take care of her. He said, I know somebody who can help you.
At the center of it all is a woman with a personal vendetta, one that could endanger even more lives.
She had killed my mom. My life's probably in danger too.
We know her to be, however you define it, evil.
May 24th, 1992, Jackson, Mississippi. It's Sunday afternoon, and Richard Mosby and his new wife are dropping off his two young sons at their mother Gail's home.
Deborah and Richard had the boys, Bill and Joseph, for the weekend. They were 7 and 9. They were to return the children to their mother at 5 p.m.
We knocked on the door, my mom didn't answer.
Door's locked and it never locked. I was trying to figure out what's going on because my mom's car is right there.
I'm so young, I'm not thinking anything's... You don't go there when you're that age. But I got the sense that Bill understood something was wrong.
Richard's wife, Deborah, leaves a note on Gail's car, and they ask the next-door neighbor to call if they hear from her.
About 6 o'clock, the neighbor was concerned because Gail was very responsible. There was some reason why she would not be there. So he had a key, and he went into her home to look for her.
Everything seemed orderly in the house, which was consistent with the way she did things. She was apparently a neat housekeeper, but everything appeared to be in order.
At least until he reached the main bathroom.
And he was horrified to find that she was in her bathtub, and Gail Mosby was dead.
She was unclothed. Her body was in the bathtub with her feet hanging outside the bathtub. Her head was still underwater. She had died from drowning. There was no other explanation for it.
Gail's neighbor immediately calls 911. Police and paramedics arrive on the scene minutes later.
When the police arrived, they noticed no sign of a struggle. They didn't see anything being disturbed. They found her clothes had been folded and left by the bathtub. They also found a journal. Also, they did find some prescriptions. I can't specifically recall what they were, but the kinds of things you would expect somebody who had been depressed to have been prescribed. You put that package together, that kind of tips you over towards suicide.
But before that determination can be made, police must do a full evaluation of the scene.
That evening, I was just on active patrol, and I got the call of a deceased subject at that location. and there was no signs of any disturbance, any foul play. I did notice that one of her legs had a small bruise on the inside of her left ankle. I could tell there was frothing from the mouth, and there was a small amount of blood in the water, which would indicate the lungs were struggling for air.
To an experienced officer, something immediately stands out.
The thing that got me is the fact that the water was shallow. Your body's not going to let you kill yourself drowning in shallow water. Your body's going to fight. It's not going to let you drown in inches of water. Normally, I probably would not have even called the homicide detectives out. But the fact that there was blood in the water, that there's just inches of water in the tub, I called homicide.
They thought that my mom had committed suicide. I never believed that for a second. My mom valued family the most in life. I knew something happened to her.
Gail Petkovzak was born September 13, 1952, in Natchez, Mississippi. She was one of 3 sisters raised in a devoutly Catholic home.
My grandparents, Frank and Jackie, had 3 daughters, Gail, Lisa, and Jackie. Gail was the eldest. My mom is Lisa. She was the middle child, and then Jackie was the baby.
They were a loving household. My grandparents understood that, you had to work hard to be able to appreciate the fun things in life.
My Aunt Gail growing up, they always described her as very studious. She was very, very intelligent. She graduated as salutatorian of her high school.
When my mom graduated from high school, she went to Northwestern to study to become a nurse.
Post-graduation, she became a very successful NICU nurse, where she took care of the tiniest and most fragile little babies and enjoyed her job immensely.
By her late 20s, Gail had a thriving career in Jackson, Mississippi, and she was ready to start a family of her own.
My mom and dad met when my Aunt Liz, who worked with my mom, introduced them.
Richard Mosby was from Canton, Mississippi. He was referred to as happy or smiley. He always had a big smile on his face.
Richard's fun-loving nature was the perfect complement to Gail's ambition. After a brief courtship, they decided to tie the knot.
My parents were married in 1981. They had my brother Bill in 1982, and then I was born in 1985.
They appeared to be very happy, very much in love, and Gail was happy to finally have found someone.
To support their growing family, Richard started a tire business in Hammond, Louisiana. He and Gail bought a house there and settled into their new life.
My first memories of life were growing up in Hammond. My dad was a great dad, and my mom was a great mom. I felt loved by both of them.
My father had a family tire business in Canton, Mississippi that was fairly successful. And I think my dad wanted to try to duplicate that. But unfortunately, the business failed.
Gail continued to work as a nurse, but 2 children and rent payments were too much to afford on one salary. So she and Richard made the difficult decision to move back to Jackson.
When they moved back, Richard went back to work, I understand, for the tire company. He was not making the money he had made prior. There was a lot of stress.
The failure of the tire business and the strain economically that it put on my family ended up leading to them divorcing.
My parents got divorced in 1986, but they still got along great. I mean, it was a happy family still. It's just that they weren't married.
Following the divorce, my mom had full custody and my dad had every other weekend.
They got along better post-divorce than they did when they were married. They were very amicable.
2 2 years later, Richard remarried, but Gail remained single. For her, motherhood came before everything else.
My mom's greatest aspiration was to be able to see me and my brother successful and grow up to be the best we could be.
I don't know how my mother could be as patient as she was with me. That's what made my mother such a great mother, is how much I sensed that she cared about me.
After being a single mom for 6 years, Gail has been found dead in her bathtub of an apparent suicide. Her journal, found at the scene, offers a potential reason for why she would end her own life.
She had been having some problems with depression at the time. It describes a very unhappy breakup with the woman she had been having apparently pretty long-term relationship with.
I never really knew that they were dating at the time, my mom and her girlfriend, but I still remember my mom on the couch after they had broken up, crying and just being very, very affected by this breakup.
In Mississippi, in the early 90s, having a homosexual relationship would have been a very troubling thing to do in terms of societal acceptance. That would cause someone to have a hard time expressing their heartache.
Mississippi's still a conservative state, and there still is a stigma among certain people, and the climate at that time, a relationship would have been defined a lot differently.
Even with that potential motive, not everyone on scene that day is convinced that Gail Mosby chose to end her life.
There was just something amiss, and it's that old police gut feeling that something was wrong. Everything was just too damn neat. It almost looked staged. There's something we're missing here, and I can't put my finger on it.
Coming up, investigators hear about a personal grudge.
She was very nasty towards my Aunt Gail. She did not like her.
And an informant agrees to wear a wire.
It does establish that they were in the house when Gail died, and they weren't there for honorable purposes.
On the night of May 24th, 1992, with several questions lingering about single mother Gail Mosby's apparent suicide, Jackson police send homicide detective Al Ledoux to the scene.
He was a great detective, and he paid attention to detail. He immediately started working as a murder. There was a possibility that maybe she took some meds, had a bad reaction, but you got to explore all possibilities. There was absolutely nothing that would indicate anything was wrong other than there was a dead woman in the bathtub. He and I both just knew there was just something we were missing, but we didn't know what it was. And he was going to find it.
He looked around a lot and did not see anything turned over, no indication that anybody had tried to break in a window or the door. But he did happen to notice that there was a framed picture. The glass was cracked.
The more I looked at it, the more I got suspicious of it. And so was the lead detective. He and I, we just said, there's something wrong.
Investigators look to the coroner to confirm their suspicions.
The crime scene's mine. The homicide case is the homicide detectives, but the body belongs to the coroner.
As part of his duties, he pronounced her deceased and, looked at the scene, and there was nothing to indicate foul play.
There was a small abrasion on her nose, but nothing that indicated that anybody had beaten her into an unconscious state and put her in the bathtub.
The coroner rules Gail's death accidental.
I said, really, can you really drown in this bathtub? And his word was to me exactly this. He said, you can if I say you can. And I knew then, okay, this is where it's going to go. He and I got along up until this point, all the years we worked together. But I thought it was a bad judgment call on his part. And he wasn't willing to look at any other options. And for some reason, he dug his heels on this particular case due to the fact that the lead and I both felt that there was something wrong. We put on our offense report there was a death pending, and that left the door open for us for further investigation.
For now, their next step is informing Gail's immediate family of her death by apparent suicide. Ex-husband Richard is left the grim task of delivering the news to their children.
He said, look, we got to tell you something. Your mom's dead. And I said, you're joking. Well, then my dad started crying, and then I knew. And I collapsed. And I don't ever remember getting up.
Even at that age, I understood what suicide was. So to have someone tell me that my mom committed suicide was just the most absurd thing that I could think of.
As investigators contact more of Gail's family about the circumstances of her death, her loved ones say it's more likely someone did this to her.
2 weeks prior to her death, Aunt Gail called my mom and was worried that something was going to happen. And she said she didn't feel safe. My mom, as a sister would do, tried to reassure her, I'm sure everything's going to be fine. But my mom had to go, so she cut the conversation short. And unfortunately, that was the last time she spoke with her.
Her sister suspects Gail's concerns had something to do with Richard and his new wife, Deborah. She says tension has been growing between them since Deborah and Richard got married 4 years ago.
After the divorce, Aunt Gail and Uncle Richard, they were very amicable, co-parented very well. After Debbie came into the picture, the parenting dynamic changed a little bit.
Debbie was married before she met my dad. She had 2 children. One of them did not survive infancy. And after my dad and Debbie got married, they had a daughter, Sarah. Debbie treated my brother and I tremendously different than the way she treated Sarah.
Debbie and my father's relationships sort of made us a little bit more secondary. It was now this third party that controlled what we were going to be doing.
All of a sudden, my mom and my dad, they started having custody battles. They're in and out of court. There's alimony disputes, and it was clear that Debbie was the one spearheading those problems.
Gail's family tells police that Deborah resented any reminders of Richard's life before her.
She didn't even like the fact that my Aunt Gail didn't change her last name post-divorce. Aunt Gail simply stated it was because that was her boy's last name, but I know it very much was a problem for Debbie.
There couldn't be a more striking difference living with my dad and Debbie versus living with my mom. My mom was loving. Living with my dad and Debbie, it was like a complete absence of love.
Debbie was very nasty towards my Aunt Gail. It was very evident that she did not like her.
Her utilities had been cut off. She had no proof who it was, but we all assumed, Gail and me and the police department, that it was coming from Debbie.
And investigators learned the situation had been a contributing factor to Gail's recent breakup.
Whatever relationship that Gail had with the woman, it ended because of all the drama that was involved in it.
But without evidence to support the idea of murder, there is little investigators can do.
In the absence of some information that indicated death by another identifiable person, there just wasn't anywhere to go with it. And so nothing really happened until the fall. In September, a woman who we now know as Vicky Mordecai went to the office of the FBI on a Sunday afternoon. And she was terrified. And what she said changed the investigation.
Four months after the death of Gail Mosby, a woman approaches the FBI seeking protection in exchange for information about the case.
What Vicky Mordecai tells this FBI agent was that she and her husband, a guy named Ricky Mordecai, were in the business of raising marijuana up in northeast Mississippi, and that an entire crop had disappeared. They were in business with her stepfather, Roy Kyle. Roy Kyle was accusing them of having stolen the crop. She told them that her stepfather, she felt, was going to hire a hitman to kill her and her husband. And that she was terrified because she knew that he had hired a hitman to kill someone else previously. A woman in Jackson, Gail Mosby. She began to describe this scenario, this woman in the bathtub. They went over to this woman's house and killed her. She said in the course of it, something glass got broken. He looks at this set of circumstances and says, well, I don't know, this is a little too crazy. But he called the Jackson Police Department, Homicide and Robbery Division.
When Jackson homicide detectives hear about the broken glass, they immediately know Vicky is telling the truth, because that detail was never made public.
So the detectives said, I want to talk to her. So she came over there and, told him the story. And he says, from whom did you get this information? She told him that she had heard this from her sister, Debbie Mosby.
According to Vicky, her and Debbie's stepfather, Roy Kyle, was only the middleman.
Deborah said, I need somebody to take care of Gail. Can you help me with it? He said, well, yeah, I know somebody who can help you.
What Vicky says that Deborah Mosby told her was that Billy Ray Ford, this hitman, had come over to their home. They lived in Canton, picked up her husband, Richard Mosby, and they drove over to Gail's house.
There was no sign of any forced entry because Gail thought she was only letting Richard in. And she didn't know Billy Ray was hiding behind the door.
Vicky says once the door was open, Billy Ray attacked Gail. And in the ensuing struggle, the picture frame shattered.
The murderer had covered her mouth and nose with a rag soaked with something until she was unconscious. And then he had taken her to the bathtub, poured the water till it got high enough and it drowned her.
When investigators run a background check on the alleged hitman Billy Ray Ford, they find a history of violence, including a past conviction for the attempted murder of the sheriff in Warren County, Mississippi.
It was reversed on appeal, so that was not a viable conviction to use against him. But, you know, he was a known criminal element out there.
Detectives put out a bolo on Ford and turned their attention to Deborah Mosby.
We knew she was harassing Gail to the point of utter absurdity, just to get her to back off collecting the child support that she was certainly entitled to.
Deborah's history with Gail adds credence to Vicky's allegations and gives Jackson police enough to open an official investigation.
We believe at that point that Gail did not commit suicide. That did not happen. So, got to do something about this.
Coming up, a history of tragedies raises even more questions.
Couldn't get past the idea that we're talking about two people who drowned in a bathtub. It sure is unusual.
And investigators face a political battle to prove their case.
She was buried without an autopsy.
So we get an order to have Gail's body exhumed.
Richard and Deborah Mosby have emerged as the primary suspects in his ex-wife's murder. But for now, the only evidence detectives have comes from a confessed marijuana farmer. With more direct evidence needed, detectives ask both Ricky and Vicky Mordecai to wear a wire.
Ricky and Vicky get wired up. They go up to Richard and Deborah's house. Ricky and Vicky are still thinking that Billy Ray Ford has a contract to kill them. So they go there to talk to Deborah and Richard about how terrified they are and can Deborah intervene and keep this hitman from coming to kill them just as he did Gail.
With investigators listening in, Deborah admits knowing Billy Ray, but denies hiring him to kill anyone.
What Deborah was talking about was not that she hired him to murder her. She hired him to go over there and scare her or rough her up or, you know, just make her go away. The language is not the smoking gun we want, but it's helpful. It does, in fact, establish that Billy Ray Ford and Richard Mosby were in the house when Gail died.
After the sting operation, police subpoenaed Deborah's phone records.
About a month prior to Gail's death, one night, Deborah Mosby calls her stepfather, who happens to have connections with a hitman.
Roy calls Billy Ray Ford, who in turn calls Deborah, and then Deborah calls him back. To our knowledge, Deborah had never known Billy Ray Ford before she was put in touch with him by Roy Kyle.
Call logs show that in the month leading up to Gail's death, Deborah and Billy Ray spoke several times.
These people don't know each other from Adam's house cat, but they're having all these conversations. It looked pretty bad, smelled pretty bad, but did we really have it? Not so sure. So we indicted them for conspiracy to commit murder.
Authorities arrest Richard, Deborah, and Billy Ray without incident. The bizarre murder plot captures headlines throughout the region.
My father and Debbie, they were trying to tell us that it was my grandparents and my aunts, and they were out to get us. There's no truth to it. Whenever I found out that Debbie was also arrested, my initial thoughts were, this sort of makes sense. I didn't think that my dad would have done something like that. That wasn't who he was.
News of the arrests also reaches someone from Deborah's past.
Deborah's ex-husband, who was a guy named Mike McLean, he contacted me and told me some just horrendous things about her.
Mike tells authorities about a tragedy that occurred in May 1988 before his divorce from Deborah.
They had a child named Angel, and Angel was wheelchair-bound. And then they had another small child. Mike told me that the wheelchair-bound child was supposed to be watching the child in the bathtub, and the child drowned. Mike said that Deborah tried to blame the wheelchair-bound child for the negligence that caused that child to die.
Prosecutors can't ignore the similarities between the two incidents.
You couldn't get past the idea that we're talking about two people who drowned in a bathtub. It just kind of takes your breath away, doesn't it? Nobody ever could prove anything about that, but it sure is unusual.
Even with this new suspicious discovery, prosecutors aren't sure there's enough to get a conviction.
What you have to have in order to convict someone is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. We weren't there yet.
The DA's office continues to build its case, but their urgency increases when Richard and Deborah are released on bail.
They had custody of the little boy. I've never known that to happen.
Richard being the natural father, they went to live with Richard and Debbie.
Completely believing that Debbie had killed my mom. Now I'm living with her. I know that my life's probably in danger too.
Nearly 8 months after Gail Mosby was found dead in her bathtub, the two prime suspects in her murder, her ex-husband Richard and his new wife Deborah, have been released on bail. They've also retained custody of Gail and Richard's two sons, Joe and Bill.
My grandparents knew that Bill and Joe were being mistreated when they were in Richard and Deb's care, and they were doing everything they could to get custody of them.
Gail's parents ultimately prevail in the custody battle.
We moved to Baton Rouge and started living with my grandparents, which was just life-changing because now it's the first time that we've had some sense of normalcy since my mom was killed.
The prosecution, however, is still facing a major roadblock. Despite the evidence collected, the county coroner will not reverse his ruling that Gail's death was a suicide.
We knew that the cause of death was drowning, but we didn't have conclusive proof that the manner of death was homicide. She was buried without an autopsy.
One of the next things that we did was to get an order to have Gail's body exhumed and do an autopsy. One thing that we wanted to know was whether or not we could prove that she had chloroform in her system, but that was not successful. We couldn't prove or disprove that because the body was too decomposed.
The only way we were going to get this case is to call an outside pathologist.
My office hired Dr. Michael Biden, who was the premier forensic pathologist in the country. I tell him this whole story, and it was like he knew exactly where I needed to go. He said, go get your autopsy pictures. And so I did. And immediately he just zones in on this little bruise on her ankle. He knew exactly what had happened. But he said, you know, once you're unconscious, then you're not struggling anymore. They could take her unconscious body and pick her up by her ankles, place her in a body of water, and all they had to do was to get the water level over her nose.
Dr. Biden noticed abrasions on her nose, which is consistent with a rough cloth, like a towel being held over her nose. It was used to make her unconscious.
Dr. Biden said, this is not suicide. This is not an accident. This is a homicide. He made the same statement I did. You can't commit suicide in shallow water.
It didn't change the coroner's mind. He took the position that it was still a suicide and continued to do that.
He took the position that he was the coroner and that was the gospel, and there was no getting around it. To me, the victim was way more important than his ego.
Prosecutors hope that Dr. Baden's expert opinion will be enough to convince a jury. On October 10th, 1994, the joint trial of Deborah Mosby, Richard Mosby, and Billy Ray Ford begins.
Tommy and I decided that we would try the conspiracy to commit capital murder first.
As the state lays out its evidence for the conspiracy charges, one of the defendants decides to turn against the others.
It's not looking good to Billy Ray. So his lawyer comes over to counsel table and says, my client wants a deal, and he will agree to testify against Richard and Debbie, which is golden.
Ford's statement settles once and for all who the mastermind behind the murder really was.
He actually dealt with Deborah, who retained him, and she was the one he was talking to. Richard apparently pretty much did what Deborah told him to do.
It's the break prosecutors have been looking for. Now, they just have to convince a jury.
This was a case that had a lot of moving parts. The state never knows if there's going to be one person who just doesn't believe they proved their case.
With Billy Ray Ford agreeing to testify against Deborah and Richard Mosby, the couple's cases are severed. They will be tried separately for capital murder. In May 1995, the proceedings against Richard begin.
Richard decided to plead guilty to murder. So, of course, the death penalty was off the table at that point.
And it was a confusing time emotionally because as hateful and as angry as I was, the sense of relief was just overbearing. But it was very important to know that he pleaded guilty.
Prosecutors then turn their attention to the woman they believe orchestrated the crime.
The mastermind is Deborah Mosby, and we know her to be, however you define it, evil.
Debbie was the catalyst of this whole thing.
Deborah's trial begins in December 1995, 3 years after Gail's murder. The prosecution's star witnesses are the confessed hitman and a nationally acclaimed pathologist.
You can't discredit Dr. Biden. You can't do it. He's too good. He put the case together for us.
Deborah refuses to take the stand in her own defense, leaving state prosecutors to speculate on motive.
If Gail died, then the child support would stop, and that Social Security would start for the boys, which I believe at that time was going to be $1,300 a month.
My impression was that she just didn't like Gail Mosby. In fact, I think she hated her. And she just decided her life would be better without her. And it was worth having her killed.
The jury convicts Deborah on all charges, but becomes deadlocked on recommending the death penalty. Instead, she receives a life sentence.
It was the final nail in the coffin in the sense of, wow, she's where she belongs. She's in prison, and now she can't hurt anybody else.
In 2007, Billy Ray Ford and Richard Mosby were released from prison. In 2021, Deborah was released as well, after serving 26 years of her sentence.
One thing I learned from Debbie's conviction and from my dad's sentencing is that life in jail doesn't mean life in jail. It's a huge gut punch knowing that they're out of prison. But I'll say this, based on how my grandparents raised us, it's made the anger that we had towards them, it's made it small. Because what we have, it's way more important. What keeps my mom alive to me today is the relationship that I have with my brother, because she really instilled in us a sense of family, and we've never let that go.
I like to remind my own boys that, I was a product of one of the greatest mothers this world could have ever had. So I want them to be able to understand that even though she's not around, she's still all with them.
The human mind possesses an extraordinary capacity for beotehat, profound love and devastating cruelty. And nowhere is this duality more starkly revealed than in the quiet spaces of domestic life, where the bonds of family are meant to offer absolute sanctuary. In many cases of domestic tragedy, we observe a slow, almost imperceptible erosion of empathy, where minor grievances, financial anxieties, and personal resentments are allowed to fester until they completely corrupt the moral compass of those involved. These crimes do not materialize out of thin air. Rather, they are the culmination of a sequence of choices, a gradual descent into hostility that often leaves a trail of subtle warning signs. The frequency with which these tragic events occur in society speaks to a deeper vulnerability within the human condition, particularly when individuals allow bitter civil disputes, such as custody battles and alimony disagreements, to escalate into personal vendettas. When a relationship ends, the transition from shared affection to mutual separation requires a high degree of maturity. Yet all too often, the introduction of pride, territorial jealousy, and greed transforms what should be an amicable parting into a battleground. Perpetrators of these crimes frequently operate under a profound delusion of intellectual superiority, convinced that they can orchestrate the perfect deception and outsmart the collective wisdom of law enforcement and forensic science. This hubris is their ultimate undoing, as the laws of physics, biology, and human behavior invariably leave behind clues that no amount of planning can fully erase. To understand the tragic loss of Gail Petkovzak Mosby, one must first appreciate the remarkable life she built and the profound devotion she held for her family. Born on September 13, 1952, In the historic city of Natchez, Mississippi, Gail was the eldest of 3 daughters raised in a deeply loving and devoutly Catholic household by her parents, Frank and Jackie. Alongside her younger sisters, Lisa and Jackie, Gail grew up in an environment where hard work, academic dedication, and a deep respect for others were quiet but permanent fixtures of daily life. From her early youth, Gail was recognized for her intellect and studious nature, ultimately graduating as the salutatorian of her high school class. Her ambition to help others guided her to Northwestern, where she pursued rigorous studies to become a registered nurse. Upon completing her education, Gail established a highly successful career as a neonatal intensive care unit nurse in Jackson, Mississippi. In this demanding role, she spent her days and nights caring for the most fragile and vulnerable infants, a testament to her deep well of patience, empathy, and professional skill. By her late 20s, Gail was professionally fulfilled and ready to embark on the journey of motherhood, a role that would ultimately define her existence and command her total devotion. It was during this period of professional success that Gail was introduced to Richard Mosby, a man from Canton, Mississippi, who was widely known for his warm, friendly demeanor and a constant smile that earned him a reputation as a happy and easygoing individual. After a brief and hopeful courtship, the couple married in 1981 and soon welcomed their 2 sons, Bill in 1982 and Joseph in 1985. In search of economic independence and a prosperous future for their growing family, Richard established a tire business in Hammond, Louisiana. The family relocated to Hammond, where Gail continued to work as a nurse while Richard attempted to duplicate the success of his family's established tire enterprise in Mississippi. Unfortunately, the business failed to thrive, and the resulting economic strain placed an immense burden on the marriage. The pressure of managing rent, household expenses, and the care of 2 young children on a single steady salary proved insurmountable, leading the couple to make the difficult decision to return to Jackson, Mississippi, and eventually to dissolve their marriage in 1986. Despite the pain of divorce, Gail and Richard managed to maintain a remarkably amicable and cooperative relationship. Gail held full custody of the boys, while Richard enjoyed visitation every other weekend, and for a period of 2 years, they successfully co-parented their children without the bitter acrimony that so often characterizes post-divorce life. This stable and cooperative dynamic, however, began to shift dramatically after Richard remarried in 1988. His new wife, Deborah, brought a complex and troubled personal history into the marriage, having previously lost an infant child and harboring deep-seated resentments. Following their marriage, Richard and Deborah welcomed a daughter named Sarah, and almost immediately, the parenting environment underwent a stark transformation. Deborah appeared to resent any reminder of Richard's past life, displaying a particular hostility toward Gail, who chose to keep her married surname so that she would share the same last name as her beloved sons. Under Deborah's influence, the once peaceful relationship between Gail and Richard deteriorated into a series of stressful legal confrontations, custody disputes, and alimony battles. The boys, Bill and Joseph, began to notice a profound difference between the warm, loving home provided by their mother and the cold, uninviting atmosphere of their father and stepmother Kess' household, where they felt secondary to their half-sister. The hostility directed toward Gail escalated to absurd levels, including instances of harassment, such as the mysterious disconnection of her household utilities. Amidst this growing domestic turmoil, Gail also faced personal challenges, including the difficult ending of a long-term relationship with a female partner. In the socially conservative climate of Mississippi during the early 1990s, the stigma surrounding same-sex relationships made it exceedingly difficult for Gail to seek public support or express her grief openly, leaving her to process her heartache in relative isolation while continuing to shield her children from her emotional struggles. On the afternoon of Sunday, May 24, 1992, Richard and Deborah were scheduled to return 7-year-old Joseph and 9-year-old Bill to Gail's home at 5 o'clock in the afternoon after a weekend visit. Upon arriving at the house, the family found the front door locked, which was highly unusual for Gail when she was expecting her children. Gail's car was parked in the driveway, but repeated knocks on the door went unanswered. Sensing that something was amiss, Deborah left a brief note on Gail's car, and the couple asked a next-door neighbor to contact them if Gail appeared. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the neighbor, knowing Gail to be an exceptionally responsible and punctual mother, grew deeply concerned and decided to use a spare key to enter the residence. The interior of the home appeared perfectly orderly, consistent with Gail's meticulous housekeeping standards, until the neighbor reached the main bathroom. There, he made a horrific discovery. Gail was lying unclothed in her bathtub, with her feet hanging outside the tub and her head submerged beneath the water. The neighbor immediately contacted emergency services by dialing the emergency dispatch number 911, bringing police officers and paramedics to the scene within minutes. To a casual observer, the scene presented several elements that could point toward a tragic decision by Gail to end her own life. There were no obvious signs of forced entry. Her clothes were neatly folded beside the bathtub, and investigators found prescriptions for antidepressants along with a personal journal detailing her profound sadness over her recent relationship breakup. Based on these initial findings, the county coroner quickly ruled the death an accidental drowning, a conclusion that sat comfortably with the narrative of a woman struggling with depression. However, the responding patrol officers and seasoned homicide detective Al Ledoux remained deeply skeptical. Their skepticism was rooted in a fundamental understanding of human physiology and the physical reality of the scene. An experienced officer knows that the human body possesses powerful involuntary survival instincts that make it virtually impossible for a conscious, healthy adult to drown voluntarily in a few inches of shallow water. The body will naturally fight for air, thrashing and struggling against the water. Yet the bathroom showed absolutely no signs of a physical struggle. Furthermore, the responding officer noticed a small bruise on the inside of Gail's left ankle, minor abrasions on her nose, and frothing at the mouth, accompanied by a small amount of blood in the water, indicating that her lungs had desperately struggled for oxygen before she succumbed. Another critical detail was a framed picture on the wall, the glass of which was cracked, suggesting that some form of physical disruption had occurred in the room, despite the otherwise pristine order of the house. Recognizing these discrepancies, the detectives refused to close the case, officially recording Gail's passing as a death pending further investigation, thereby keeping the door open for a deeper inquiry. The investigation remained stalled for several months, leaving Gail's family to grieve in a state of unresolved anguish, until a dramatic breakthrough occurred in September 1992. A woman named Vicki Mordecai approached the Federal Bureau of Investigation on a Sunday afternoon, seeking protection and sharing a terrifying narrative. Vicky explained that she and her husband, Ricky, had been involved in an illegal marijuana cultivation enterprise in northeast Mississippi with her stepfather, Roy Kyle. When a crop went missing, Roy Kyle accused them of theft and threatened their lives. Terrified for her safety, Vicky revealed that her stepfather had recently coordinated a contract killing on behalf of her sister, Deborah Mosby. Vicky provided specific details of the crime, including the information that a hired hand named Billy Ray Ford had been retained to eliminate Gail Mosby, and that during the physical encounter, a glass picture frame had been broken. This specific detail regarding the broken glass was a closely guarded secret known only to the perpetrators and the investigating officers, instantly validating Vicky's credibility. According to Vicky, Deborah had approached her stepfather, Roy Kyle, seeking someone to take care of Gail to resolve the ongoing child support and alimony disputes. Roy Kyle had then put Deborah in touch with Billy Ray Ford, a criminal with a history of violence. On the night of the crime, Billy Ray Ford and Richard Mosby had entered Gail's home under the pretense of a routine visit. Once inside, Billy Ray Ford had subdued Gail, using a cloth soaked in an incapacitating agent to render her unconscious before carrying her to the bathtub, filling it with water, and holding her head beneath the surface to stage a drowning. Armed with this critical intelligence, the Jackson Police Department and the Federal Bureau of Investigation initiated a coordinated sting operation. Ricky and Vicky Mordecai agreed to wear hidden recording devices and visit Richard and Deborah S. residence under the guise of seeking protection from Billy Ray Ford. During the recorded conversation, Deborah admitted to knowing the hired hand, but claimed she had only engaged his services to scare Gail or force her to cease her child support demands. While this admission was not an explicit confession to murder, it provided invaluable evidence of a conspiracy. Investigators subsequently subpoenaed telephone records, which revealed a clear pattern of communication in the month leading up to Gail's death, showing calls from Deborah to Roy Kyle, who then contacted Billy Ray Ford, who in turn called Deborah back. With this compelling circumstantial evidence, a grand jury indicted Richard Mosby, Deborah Mosby, and Billy Ray Ford for conspiracy to commit murder. Following their arrest, Richard and Deborah were temporarily released on bail and retained custody of Gail's sons, placing the children in a deeply stressful and potentially dangerous environment. Gail's parents immediately initiated a custody battle, ultimately securing the safety of the boys and relocating them to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where they could finally experience stability and care. Meanwhile, the prosecution faced a major obstacle, as the local coroner stubbornly refused to revise his original ruling of suicide. To overcome this hurdle, the district attorney's office exhumed Gail's body and retained the services of Dr. Michael Baden, a preeminent forensic pathologist. Dr. Baden conducted a thorough review of the autopsy photographs and medical records, focusing on the specific injuries that the local coroner had dismissed. He identified the minor abrasions on Gail's nose as highly consistent with a rough cloth being pressed firmly over her airway to induce unconsciousness, and he explained that the bruise on her ankle indicated that she had been picked up and held by her legs to be placed into the water once she was incapacitated. Dr. Baden concluded unequivocally that Gail's death was a homicide, reinforcing the logical deduction that an individual cannot voluntarily drown in shallow water without physical restraint or prior unconsciousness. The joint trial of the defendants commenced on October 10, 1994, focusing initially on the charges of conspiracy to commit capital murder As the weight of the State's evidence became apparent, Billy Ray Ford chose to cooperate with the prosecution in exchange for a plea agreement, providing detailed testimony that identified Deborah Mosby as the primary instigator and mastermind who orchestrated the entire plot, while Richard largely followed her direction. Facing the certainty of conviction, Richard Mosby pleaded guilty to murder in May 1995, receiving a life sentence. Deborah Mosby's trial followed in December 1995, where the testimony of Billy Ray Ford and Dr. Baden proved devastating to the defense. The prosecution argued that Deborah's motive was fueled by intense personal hatred, territorial jealousy, and financial greed, as Gail's death would terminate the child support payments and allow Richard to collect Social Security benefits of approximately $1,300 per month for the children. The jury found Deborah guilty on all charges, and she was sentenced to life imprisonment. Although Richard and Billy Ray Ford were released from prison in 2007, and Deborah was paroled in 2021 after serving 26 years, the legacy of Gail's love endured through her sons, who rebuilt their lives under the care of their grandparents, carrying forward the profound sense of family and maternal devotion that Gail had instilled in them. An analysis of this tragic case reveals a complex interplay of psychological motives that are frequently observed in domestic homicides. The primary catalyst was not a sudden burst of passion, but rather a calculated accumulation of greed, resentment, and a desire for absolute control. Deborah Mosby's behavior illustrates a toxic form of territorial jealousy, where the mere existence of her husband's ex-wife was viewed as an intolerable threat to her dominance and financial security. The financial aspect of the crime is particularly telling. The desire to avoid child support payments and the prospect of acquiring Social Security benefits demonstrate how material greed can completely devalue the sanctity of human life in the mind of a perpetrator. These cases occur with troubling frequency because individuals in high-conflict divorces often allow their emotions to override their rational judgment, isolating themselves within a narrative of victimhood and resentment until they convince themselves that the permanent removal of the other party is the only viable solution. This is where a mild, analytical irony can be directed at the sheer foolishness of the criminals. In their attempts to construct a flawless deception, they relied on a method of drowning that ignored the most basic laws of human biology and physics, foolishly believing that a professional police force would simply accept a staged suicide in a few inches of water. Their elaborate conspiracy, involving multiple intermediaries and a hired hand, only succeeded in creating a massive digital and interpersonal footprint that virtually guaranteed their eventual capture. For the law enforcement community, this case highlights the critical importance of specialized training, intuitive skepticism, and rigorous physical evidence preservation. The success of the investigation relied heavily on the responding officers' willingness to question the obvious and look beyond the convenient narrative of suicide. The cracked picture frame, the subtle ankle bruise, and the shallow water level were small but vital clues that kept the case alive when official systems attempted to close it. To accelerate the resolution of such complex domestic cases, police forces must prioritize early interagency collaboration, rapid analysis of communication records, and the immediate involvement of external forensic experts when initial scene findings contradict physical logic. Additionally, the prompt cultivation of family informants and the strategic use of electronic remain indispensable tools in dismantling conspiracies. From a broader societal perspective, this tragedy offers profound life lessons in prevention and community awareness. It underscores the necessity of taking any domestic threats or feelings of insecurity seriously. Gail had expressed fear for her safety to her sister shortly before her death, a warning that, if acted upon with legal protective measures, might have altered the outcome. Families and communities must foster open channels of communication and support. Individuals navigating hot conflict separations, ensuring they are not left to face harassment in isolation. Ultimately, the resolution of this case stands as a powerful testament to the victory of justice. The dedication of the investigators who refused to let an ego-driven ruling silence the truth, and the enduring power of maternal love that continues to guide Gail's children long after her physical absence. The human mind possesses a remarkable capacity for hot profound devotion, and, conversely, the most cold and calculating forms of self-interest. In the field of criminal psychology, few phenomena are as deeply disturbing yet intellectually challenging as the intersection of domestic disputes, economic pressure, and personal vendettas. When these elements converge within a blended family, the resulting dynamics can become volatile, sometimes leading to tragic outcomes that baffle local communities and challenge the capabilities of law enforcement. The case of Gail Petkovzak Mosby, a dedicated neonatal intensive care unit nurse and loving mother from Jackson, Mississippi, stands as a poignant example of such a tragedy mote high. By examining the motives behind this crime, the subtle forensic clues that eventually expose the truth, the behavioral patterns of the perpetrators, and the structural lessons that can be drawn from the investigation, society can gain a deeper understanding of how to prevent similar occurrences and how justice can be pursued more effectively. To fully comprehend why such a tragedy occurs, one must first analyze the complex web of interpersonal relationships and economic pressures that often precede domestic violence. In many instances, the breakdown of a marriage does not mark the end of conflict, but rather the beginning of a prolonged and stressful struggle over resources, custody, and personal boundaries. Gail Mosby and her former husband, Richard Mosby, had established what appeared to be an amicable co-parenting relationship following their divorce in the year 1986. They shared custody of their two young sons, Bill and Joseph, who were 7 and 9 years of age at the time of the events in 1992. For several years, this arrangement functioned smoothly, grounded in Gail's unwavering commitment to the well-being of her children. However, the equilibrium of this post-divorce dynamic was severely disrupted when Richard remarried a woman named Deborah Mosby in the year 1988. The introduction of a new spouse into a co-parenting relationship often changes the family dynamic, but in this case, it introduced an escalating level of hostility. Deborah Mosby harbored a deep-seated resentment toward Gail, which seemed to stem from both emotional and financial sources. Sociologists and psychologists who study family conflicts note that step-parents sometimes experience intense jealousy regarding the biological parents of their stepchildren, viewing any remaining connection, even purely administrative or financial co-parenting obligations, as a threat to their own standing. In this case, Deborah's hostility was manifested in a series of petty but cruel actions, such as allegedly having Gail's utility services disconnected and expressing extreme irritation over Gail's decision to retain her married surname for the sake of her sons. More significantly, the conflict was fueled by ongoing, legal battles over child support and alimony. Economic strain is one of the most common catalysts for domestic disputes, and when coupled with personal animosity, it can lead individuals to make incredibly destructive choices. Deborah apparently viewed the monthly child support payments that Richard was legally obligated to pay to Gail as an unacceptable drain on their household finances. The defense would later suggest that the prospect of terminating these payments, combined with a potential to collect Social Security benefits for the children in the event of their mother's death, provided a strong financial incentive for the crime. This financial motive was intertwined with a personal vendetta, as Deborah seemed determined to assert complete control over the children's lives and erase any influence of their biological mother. The psychological profile of Deborah Mosby, as reconstructed through witness testimonies and court proceedings, reveals a highly manipulative individual who possessed a troubling ability to influence others to carry out her desires. Her husband, Richard, described by acquaintances as a generally pleasant but weak-willed person, seemed to fall entirely under her influence, executing her directives even when they ran counter to the safety and well-being of his own children. To carry out their plan, Deborah did not rely on her husband alone. She sought the assistance of her stepfather, Roy Kyle, who acted as an intermediary to recruit a hired hand named Billy Ray Ford Bone. This reliance on a network of accomplices highlights a common characteristic of conspiratorial crimes, where the primary instigator distances themselves physically from the act while orchestrating the logistics from behind the scenes. Despite the conspirators' efforts to stage the scene as a self-inflicted tragedy, their plan ultimately collapsed due to several critical oversight errors and the diligence of seasoned investigators. When Gail Mosby was discovered deceased in her bathtub on the evening of Sunday, May 24, 1992, the initial appearance of the scene strongly suggested a tragedy of a personal nature mote high. The presence of folded clothing nearby, a personal journal detailing a recent difficult breakup, and prescription medications for depression all pointed toward a self-inflicted drowning. The local coroner, perhaps influenced by these superficial indicators and the lack of obvious signs of forced entry, quickly ruled the death an accident. However, experienced law enforcement officers are trained to look past first impressions and focus on details that do not align with the standard patterns of human behavior. In this case, a patrol officer and the lead homicide detective, Al Ledoux, noticed several highly anomalous details that cast doubt on the suicide theory. The most significant physical clue was the shallow level of the water in the bathtub. From a physiological standpoint, it is extraordinarily difficult, if not virtually impossible, for a conscious adult to voluntarily drown in shallow water. The human body's autonomic nervous system possesses powerful involuntary survival mechanisms that trigger a violent struggle for air when oxygen is deprived. An individual attempting to end their own life in such a manner would almost certainly experience an uncontrollable survival reflex, making a quiet, passive drowning in mere inches of water highly improbable. Furthermore, the physical state of the victim's body presented clear evidence of a struggle. Investigators observed a small amount of blood in the bathwater and frothing at the mouth, both of which are classic indicators of pulmonary edema, a condition where the lungs struggle violently for air against an obstruction. A crime scene investigator also noticed a small abrasion on Gail's nose and a distinct bruise on the inside of her left ankle. These injuries, though minor in appearance, were entirely inconsistent with a peaceful, voluntary act. A particularly telltale piece of physical evidence was a framed photograph in the living area, the glass of which was cracked. This small detail suggested that a physical struggle had occurred elsewhere in the home before the victim was moved to the bathroom. The sophistication of the criminals in this case was characterized by a combination of meticulous planning and profound ignorance of forensic science and human psychology. On one hand, they demonstrated a high degree of calculation by choosing a time when the children were away, utilizing Richard's familiarity to gain entry without force, and using a chemical agent to render the victim unconscious before placing her in the water bone. They also took the time to stage the scene by folding her clothes and placing her journal in a prominent position, hoping that the societal stigma surrounding her personal life in the early 1990s would prompt a quick ruling of suicide without a thorough investigation. On the other hand, their execution was marred by fundamental logical flaws. By placing the victim in the bathtub with her feet hanging outside the tub, they created a highly unnatural posture that immediately aroused the suspicion of arriving officers Namsao. More importantly, they failed to realize that by involving multiple individuals in the conspiracy, they had exponentially increased the likelihood of detection. In the world of criminal enterprise, a secret shared among multiple parties is rarely kept for long, especially when those individuals are engaged in other illicit activities. The breakthrough in the case came not from a sudden confession, but from an unrelated federal investigation into illegal agricultural cultivation in northeast Mississippi. Deborah's sister, Vicki Mordecai, and her husband, Ricky Mordecai, were involved in an illicit farming operation with Deborah's stepfather, Roy Kyle. When a dispute arose over a missing crop, Vicki became terrified that her stepfather would employ the same hired hand used in Gail's case to harm her and her husband. Seeking protection, Vicki approached the Federal Bureau of Investigation and disclosed the details of the conspiracy that Deborah had shared with her in confidence. The inclusion of the detail about the broken picture frame, a piece of information that had never been released to the public, immediately validated Vicki's account and allowed the Jackson Police Department to reopen the case with renewed vigor. The subsequent investigation demonstrated the power of collaborative law enforcement and strategic planning. To gather direct evidence, investigators utilized a common but highly effective technique. They equipped Vicki and Ricky Mordecai ve Kepite hat recording devices and sent them to converse with Deborah and Richard Mosby. Although Deborah did not explicitly confess to murder on the recordings, she admitted to hiring Billy Ray Ford to go to Gail's home to intimidate her, and her phone records revealed a dense web of communication between herself, her stepfather, and the hired hand in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. This communication pattern between individuals who had no prior social or professional relationship provided powerful circumstantial evidence of a conspiracy. To overcome the administrative hurdle presented by the stubborn local coroner, who refused to alter his original ruling, the prosecution took the unusual step of exhuming Gail's body for a comprehensive autopsy. They retained the services of a preeminent national forensic pathologist, Dr. Michael Baden, whose expertise proved decisive. Dr. Baden's meticulous examination of the autopsy photographs and the physical evidence confirmed that the injuries on the victim's nose were consistent with a rough cloth being forcibly held over her face to cause oxygen deprivation. He explained to the jury that once the victim was rendered unconscious, she was placed in the cold water, where her automatic respiratory reflexes caused her to draw water into her lungs, leading to her death. B. This expert testimony effectively dismantled the defense suicide theory and provided the scientific foundation needed to secure a conviction. During the joint trial in October of 1994, the conspiracy began to disintegrate as the defendants faced the overwhelming weight of the state's evidence. Ba. Recognizing the strength of the prosecution's case, Billy Ray Ford agreed to testify against Richard and Deborah in exchange for a plea agreement, confirming that Deborah was indeed the mastermind who had orchestrated the entire plot and agreed to pay him $5,000 for the act. Ba. This testimony led to separate trials for the couple. Richard Mosby subsequently pleaded guilty to his role in the crime, while Deborah Mosby was convicted by a jury in December of 1995 and sentenced to life in prison. Several profound life lessons can be drawn from this tragic case to help prevent similar occurrences in the future. First, it highlights the critical importance of paying close attention to escalating patterns of domestic harassment. Gail Mosby had expressed deep concern for her safety to her sister just 2 weeks prior to her death, noting that she felt unsafe and suspecting that Deborah was behind various forms of harassment, such as the disconnection of her utility services. In many domestic violence cases, physical violence is preceded by a long period of psychological abuse, stalking, and administrative harassment. Communities and family members must take these warning signs seriously, offer support to victims, and assist them in documenting and reporting such behavior to the authorities before it escalates to physical harm. Second, the case underscores the necessity of professional skepticism and rigorous scientific standards within the medical legal investigative system. The initial ruling of suicide by the local coroner, based on superficial scene appearances and a personal reluctance to reconsider his judgment, nearly allowed a heinous crime to go unpunished. It was only through the persistence of the responding police officers, the dedication of Detective Al Ledoux, and the expertise of Dr. Michael Baden that justice was ultimately served bay. This demonstrates that agencies responsible for determining the cause and manner of death must remain entirely objective, collaborative, and willing to re-examine their findings in light of new physical evidence. To catch perpetrators of complex conspiracies faster, modern law enforcement agencies have adopted several key practices, many of which are illustrated by this case. The integration of local, state, and federal resources is paramount. The breakthrough in Gail Mosby case occurred because a federal agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation recognized the significance of a local homicide detail within a completely unrelated informant S statement, and immediately shared that information with municipal detectives. Today, intelligence sharing databases and joint task forces allow different agencies to connect seemingly unrelated crimes, such as illegal agriculture and contract violence, much more rapidly. Additionally, the preservation of key physical details of a crime scene, such as the broken picture frame, is crucial. By keeping specific details of the scene confidential, investigators can easily verify the authenticity of informant statements, distinguishing genuine leads from false rumors. Modern technology has also greatly enhanced the speed of telephone record analysis and digital forensics, allowing investigators to map out communication networks among conspirators within hours rather than weeks or months. Ultimately, the story of Gail Mosby is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of familial love. Despite the tragic loss of their mother at such a young age, Her sons, Bill and Joseph, were rescued from a hostile environment and raised in a loving, supportive household by their maternal grandparents. The values of patience, dedication, and familial devotion that Gail instilled in her children during their early years survived her, carried forward by her sons as they grew into adulthood and raised their own families. In the end, the elaborate and malicious conspiracy orchestrated by Deborah Mosby failed to erase Gail's legacy, proving that while cold self-interest can cause immense pain, the bond of maternal love and the pursuit of justice possess a strength that cannot be easily extinguished. On a Sunday afternoon in the month of May in the year 1992, a quiet residential neighborhood in the city of Jackson, Mississippi, became the setting for a tragedy that would puzzle investigators and deeply affect a local community for years to come. It was the 24th day of May, and the weather was typical of late spring in the southern United States. Richard Mosby and his second wife, Deborah, were driving toward the home of his former wife, Gail Petkovzak Mosby, to return his two young sons, Bill and Joseph, who were aged 9 and 7 respectively. The boys had spent the weekend with their father and stepmother as part of a regular visitation schedule that had been established following the amicable divorce of Richard and Gail several years prior. The agreement was simple and routine, requiring the children to be returned to their mother by 5 in the afternoon. When the vehicle pulled into the driveway, the boys ran to the front door, expecting the warm and welcoming embrace of their mother, who was known to be a deeply devoted parent. They knocked on the door, but there was no response. The silence from within the house was immediately concerning, as Gail's car was parked in the driveway, and she was exceptionally disciplined regarding her schedule and the care of her children. Joseph, despite his young age, sensed that something was amiss. The front door, which was normally left unlocked when Gail was at home, was firmly secured. Richard and Deborah decided to leave a brief note on the windshield of Gail's car, asking her to contact them as soon as she returned, and they subsequently requested a next-door neighbor to keep an eye on the residents and notify them if any activity was observed. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the neighbor began to feel increasingly anxious. Gail was widely recognized as a highly responsible mother and an exceptionally organized individual who would never leave her young children waiting without a valid explanation. Possessing a spare key to the residence for emergencies, the neighbor decided to enter the home to investigate. Upon crossing the threshold, the interior of the house appeared completely orderly. Gail was known as a meticulous housekeeper, and everything seemed to be in its proper place, with no immediate signs of a disturbance or forced entry. However, this sense of normalcy vanished when the neighbor reached the primary bathroom. There, a horrifying scene awaited. Gail was found unclothed in the bathtub, with her head submerged beneath the water and her legs hanging outside the tub. She was completely unresponsive. The neighbor immediately contacted the emergency services by dialing 911, prompting a rapid response from local law enforcement and medical personnel. When the officers from the Jackson Police Department arrived at the scene, they initially encountered a situation that seemed to point toward a tragic self-inflicted incident or a sudden medical emergency. Beside the bathtub, Gail's clothes had been neatly folded and placed on the floor. A search of the home revealed a journal in which Gail had written about her struggles. Vécap été, hot emotional distress and depression, particularly following the painful dissolution of a long-term personal relationship. Additionally, Several prescription medications commonly prescribed for depressive symptoms were located in the residence. To an outside observer or a less experienced investigator, these combined elements would strongly suggest that Gail had made a conscious decision to end her own life. However, a patrol officer on the scene, who paid close attention to detail, began to notice several inconsistencies that raised serious doubts. The responding officer observed that the water in the bathtub was remarkably shallow, measuring only a few inches deep. This physical reality contradicted the idea of an accidental or self-inflicted drowning. Under normal circumstances, the human body possesses powerful, involuntary survival instincts that make it virtually impossible for a conscious individual to drown themselves in shallow water, as the physiological drive to breathe would force them to lift their head. Furthermore, the officer noted the presence of foam or frothing around Gail's mouth and a small amount of blood in the water, which typically indicates a violent struggle for oxygen within the lungs. A closer examination of Gail's body revealed a small bruise on the inner aspect of her left ankle and a minor abrasion on her nose. These physical marks, combined with the unusually low water level and the presence of frothing, led the officer to suspect that this was not a case of self-harm, but rather a staged crime scene designed to mislead investigators. Despite these critical observations, the local county coroner arrived at a different conclusion. After examining the scene and the body, the coroner ruled Gail's death as an accidental drowning. The lead homicide detective, Al Ledoux, and his colleagues were highly skeptical of this ruling. They believed that the physical evidence and the overall presentation of the scene strongly indicated homicide. In a house that was otherwise perfectly tidy, Detective Ledoux noticed a framed photograph with shattered glass lying on the floor. This single disrupted item suggested a sudden physical struggle that the perpetrators had failed to fully clean or conceal. Because of the sharp disagreement between the police department and the coroner's office, the investigators took the crucial step of listing the case as a death, pending further investigation in their official reports. This administrative decision kept the investigation active and allowed detectives to continue searching for the truth. In the days and weeks following Gail's death, her family members vociferously rejected the notion of self-harm. They knew her as an intelligent, resilient, and deeply loving woman who lived entirely for her children. Gail had graduated as the salutatorian of her high school in Natchez, Mississippi, and had gone on to achieve significant professional success as a nurse in a neonatal intensive care unit. Her career was dedicated to caring for the most fragile infants, a role that required immense patience, compassion, and mental fortitude. Her family explained that while Gail had indeed experienced sadness over a recent relationship ending, she was actively planning for the future and would never abandon her sons. Furthermore, Gail's sister revealed a critical piece of information that redirected the focus of the investigation. 2 weeks before her death, Gail had called her sister, expressing a profound sense of fear and stating that she did not feel safe in her own home. This fear was directly linked to the escalating hostility she was experiencing from her former husband, Richard, and more specifically, from his second wife, Deborah. Following Gail's divorce from Richard in 1986, the two had maintained a cooperative and friendly co-parenting relationship. However, this dynamic shifted dramatically after Richard married Deborah in 1988. Deborah, who had experienced personal tragedies in her past, including the loss of an infant child, began to exhibit an intense resentment toward Gail. This animosity extended to any reminder of Richard's previous marriage, including the fact that Gail had chosen to keep the surname of Mosby so that she would share the same last name as her young sons. According to family members and friends, Deborah actively orchestrated a campaign of harassment against Gail. The amicable relationship between the former spouses dissolved into a series of bitter court battles over child custody, alimony, and child support payments. Deborah micromanaged Richard's interactions. Vec kept to hat his sons and fostered a toxic environment where the boys felt secondary to the daughter Richard and Deborah had together. The harassment escalated to the point where Gail's home utilities were mysteriously disconnected, an incident that Gail and her family strongly believed was initiated by Deborah. This constant psychological pressure and economic warfare had also contributed to the breakdown of Gail's recent personal relationship. As the sheer volume of drama surrounding the household became overwhelming. Despite these compelling background details, the Jackson Police Department faced a significant hurdle. They had no direct physical evidence linking Richard or Deborah to Gail's death, and the official coroner's ruling of accidental drowning remained a formidable obstacle to filing criminal charges. The investigation stalled during the summer months, but a major breakthrough occurred in September of 1992, approximately 4 months after the crime. A woman named Vicki Mordecai approached the local office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation on a Sunday afternoon. She was visibly terrified and sought government protection in exchange for information regarding a series of illegal activities. Vicki and her husband, Ricky Mordecai, had been involved in an illicit marijuana cultivation operation in northeastern Mississippi alongside Vicki's stepfather, a man named Roy Kyle. Recently, a significant portion of their crop had disappeared, and Roy Kyle had accused Vicki and her husband of theft. Fearing that her stepfather would hire a contract killer to eliminate them, Vicki decided to cooperate with law enforcement. She explained to the federal agents that she knew her stepfather had access to contract killers because he had recently assisted her sister, Deborah Mosby, in hiring an individual to murder someone in Jackson. Vicki proceeded to describe a highly specific scenario that perfectly matched the circumstances of Gail's death. She stated that Deborah had approached Roy Kyle, expressing a desire to have Gail eliminated to resolve their ongoing legal and financial disputes. Roy Kyle had then put Deborah in contact with a violent criminal named Billy Ray Ford, who agreed to carry out the deed in exchange for a payment of $5,000. According to Vicki, on the night of Gail's death, Billy Ray Ford and Richard Mosby had driven to Gail's residence. Because Gail recognized her former husband, she opened the door without hesitation, unaware that Ford was hiding nearby. Once inside, a physical struggle ensued, during which a framed picture was knocked to the floor and shattered. The perpetrator then used a chemical agent, believed to be chloroform, to render Gail unconscious before placing her body into the bathtub to simulate a drowning. When the federal agents conveyed this information to the Jackson Police Department, Detective Ledoux and his team immediately recognized the validity of Vicki's statement. The detail regarding the shattered picture frame had never been released to the public or the media. It was a piece of information known only to the investigators and the individuals who were present in the house when Gail died. This confirmation galvanized the police, who immediately initiated a comprehensive background check on Billy Ray Ford. They discovered that Ford was a highly dangerous individual with a lengthy criminal history, including a prior conviction for the attempted murder of a county sheriff, which had subsequently been overturned on appeal. To gather concrete evidence that would stand up in a court of law, investigators asked Vicky and her husband, Ricky, to participate in a covert operation. Equipped with hidden recording devices, the couple visited the residence of Richard and Deborah Mosby. Under the guise of seeking protection from Billy Ray Ford, they engaged Deborah in a conversation about the hitman. While Deborah was cautious and denied formally hiring Ford to commit murder, she openly admitted on the recording that she had hired him to go to Gail's house to scare her and force her to drop her child support demands. While this recording was not a direct confession to murder, it provided undeniable proof of a conspiracy and established that Deborah, Richard, and Billy Ray Ford were in communication and actively plotting against Gail. Following this successful sting operation, investigators obtained Deborah's telephone records. The logs revealed a highly suspicious pattern of communication in the month leading up to Gail's death. There were numerous telephone calls between Deborah, her stepfather Roy Kyle, and Billy Ray Ford. This electronic trail demolished any claims of a casual or accidental association, showing a coordinated effort to plan the crime. Armed with this evidence, a grand jury indicted Deborah Mosby, Richard Mosby, and Billy Ray Ford for conspiracy to commit murder, and the 3 individuals were arrested. During the initial phase of the legal proceedings, a shocking revelation from Deborah's past came to light. Her former husband contacted the authorities to report a highly suspicious tragedy that had occurred during their marriage in 1988. They had a young child who was wheelchair-bound and another infant. The infant had tragically drowned in a bathtub, and Deborah had attempted to place the blame for the incident on the disabled child. This revelation sent shockwaves through the prosecution team, as the similarity between the 2 bathtub drownings was too striking to ignore. Although no charges had ever been filed in the earlier incident, it highlighted a chilling pattern of behavior and reinforced the belief that Deborah was a highly manipulative and dangerous individual. Despite the gravity of the charges, the prosecution faced a major crisis when Richard and Deborah were released on bail. Because Richard was the biological father and the state had not yet secured a formal conviction, the 2 suspects were temporarily allowed to retain custody of Gail's young sons. This was a terrifying period for the boys, who fully believed that their stepmother had murdered their mother and feared for their own safety. Fortunately, Gail's parents fought a relentless legal battle and ultimately secured full custody of the boys, moving them to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where they could finally experience a sense of safety and normalcy. To secure a conviction for capital murder, the prosecutors knew they had to overcome the coroner's official ruling of suicide. They obtained a court order to exhume Gail's body and conduct a comprehensive forensic autopsy. Although tests for chemical agents like chloroform were inconclusive due to the passage of time and tissue decomposition, the prosecution hired a highly respected national forensic pathologist, Dr. Michael Baden, to review the case. Dr. Baden carefully analyzed the original crime scene photographs and the autopsy records. He focused intensely on the small bruise on Gail's ankle and the abrasions on her nose. Dr. Baden concluded that these physical marks were entirely consistent with a forced drowning. He explained that a perpetrator had likely used a rough cloth or towel to hold a chemical agent over Gail's nose and mouth, rendering her unconscious. Once she was incapacitated, the perpetrators had lifted her by her ankles and placed her face down in the shallow water of the bathtub, holding her head submerged until she drowned. Dr. Baden stated unequivocally that it was physically impossible for a conscious individual to commit suicide in such a shallow depth of water as the body's natural reflexes would prevent it. This expert medical opinion provided the scientific foundation the prosecution needed to dismantle the defense. In October of 1994, the joint trial of the 3 defendants began. Realizing the strength of the state's case, Billy Ray Ford's legal counsel approached the prosecutors to negotiate a plea agreement. In exchange for a reduced sentence, Ford agreed to testify against Richard and Deborah, confirming that Deborah was the mastermind who had initiated and financed the conspiracy, while Richard had played a compliant role, executing his wife's demands. Following this breakthrough, the cases were severed, and Richard Mosby subsequently chose to plead guilty to murder, receiving a life sentence and avoiding the potential application of the death penalty. In December of 1995, Deborah Mosby stood trial for capital murder. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including the testimony of Billy Ray Ford, the forensic analysis of Dr. Michael Baden, and the incriminating telephone records. The state argued that Deborah was driven by an intense, obsessive hatred of Gail, combined with a financial motive to eliminate child support payments and secure Social Security survivor benefits for the children. After a brief deliberation, the jury found Deborah guilty of capital murder. While they were unable to reach a unanimous decision regarding the death penalty, she was sentenced to serve a term of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This landmark case offers profound insights into the psychological dynamics of domestic violence and the critical importance of meticulous forensic science. The primary motive for this heinous crime was a combination of economic greed and pathological jealousy. In many domestic homicides, financial disputes over child support and alimony serve as major catalysts for violence. To a highly manipulative and possessive individual like Deborah Mosby, these monthly payments were not seen as a necessary contribution to the welfare of Richard's children, but rather as a personal financial loss and a symbol of Gail's ongoing influence over her husband. This toxic perception, combined with the prospect of gaining financial control over the children's Social Security benefits, created a powerful economic incentive to commit murder. From a psychological perspective, the case illustrates the phenomenon of a shared delusion, or a dominant submissive dynamic within a marriage. Deborah possessed a highly controlling personality, whereas Richard was easily influenced and lacked the moral strength to resist her demands. Over time, Deborah successfully dismantled Richard's relationship with his former wife, replaced his parental affection with hostility, and ultimately convinced him to participate in a conspiracy to take the life of the mother of his children. This underscores the danger of toxic relationships, where one partner systematically erodes the ethical boundaries of the other. The successful resolution of this case was entirely dependent on the analytical skills and persistence of the investigating officers. The perpetrators exhibited a high degree of sophistication. By staging the crime scene to mimic a suicide, they utilized a chemical agent to avoid leaving obvious signs of a physical struggle, folded Gail's clothes neatly, and relied on her known personal struggles with depression to create a plausible narrative of self-harm. They also chose a method of death, drowning, that is historically difficult to prove as a homicide without an autopsy. However, their sophisticated plan was undone by minor details that they failed to consider. The seasoned investigators relied on physical anomalies that did not align with a typical suicide. The shallow water level, the frothing at the mouth, the cracked picture frame, and the tiny physical marks on Gail's body were all subtle clues that a less diligent police force might have ignored. This case serves as a powerful reminder of the value of professional intuition and the need for law enforcement to maintain an open and skeptical mind, even when initial appearances suggest a straightforward explanation. The dedication of Detective Ledoux and his team, who refused to accept the coroner's hasty ruling, was the ultimate force that brought these criminals to justice. For the wider community, this tragedy offers critical life lessons in safety and conflict resolution. When domestic disputes escalate to the point of harassment, utility disconnections, and verbal threats, it is vital for individuals to take these warning signs seriously. Gail had expressed her fears to her family, but like many victims of domestic harassment, she did not fully anticipate the extreme lengths to which her perpetrators would go. It is essential for individuals experiencing high-conflict divorces or custody battles to establish clear boundaries, document all instances of harassment, and seek legal protection and professional security assessments. Furthermore, family members and friends must act proactively when a loved one expresses fear for their safety, helping them to find secure shelter or contact law enforcement. To catch perpetrators faster and prevent similar tragedies, police forces must adopt a multidisciplinary approach that emphasizes rapid communication and the preservation of physical evidence. In this case, the initial conflict between the police department and the coroner's office highlights the need for standardized protocols in death investigations. When a suspicious death occurs, a comprehensive forensic autopsy should be conducted immediately, rather than relying on a preliminary visual assessment. The integration of modern technology, such as the rapid analysis of electronic communication logs and the use of undercover recording devices, remains a cornerstone of successful conspiracy investigations. By combining advanced forensic science traditional investigative techniques, and a deep understanding of victimology, law enforcement can quickly dismantle complex criminal schemes. In the decades following the trial, the individuals involved in this conspiracy served their respective sentences. Richard Mosby and Billy Ray Ford were released from prison in the year 2007, while Deborah Mosby was paroled in the year 2021 after serving 26 years of her life sentence. For Gail's sons, the loss of their mother was a permanent scar, but through the love and support of their maternal grandparents in Baton Rouge, they were able to rebuild their lives and grow into successful family-oriented men. They carry forward the legacy of their mother, remembering her not for the tragic manner of her death, but for the profound love, intelligence, and dedication she brought to their lives. Gail's story stands as a testament to the enduring power of familial love and the ultimate victory of justice over a dark and calculated conspiracy. The human mind possesses a remarkable capacity for profound benevolence, and conversely, highly calculated deception. When examining the dark corridors of domestic malice, investigators and sociologists alike are frequently confronted with a recurring phenomenon where personal vendettas, financial greed, and unresolved emotional conflicts converge to produce tragic outcomes. In many such instances, the perpetrator operates under the grand illusion of their own absolute cleverness, convinced that a meticulously staged scene will easily bypass the scrutiny of law enforcement. This specific type of transgression where a domestic dispute escalates into a lethal conspiracy disguised as a self-inflicted tragedy, represents a distinct category of criminal behavior that is both deeply troubling and highly study-worthy for modern criminology. To understand why these cases occur with such unfortunate frequency, one must dissect the underlying motives that drive individuals to cross the line from standard domestic friction into the realm of organized malice. At the absolute core of these actions is almost always a combination of intense economic pressure and deep-seated psychological resentment. In many family structures that have undergone the transition of divorce, the financial arrangements, specifically child support, alimony, and custody agreements, become battlegrounds. To a highly possessive or resentful new partner, the ongoing financial obligations of a spouse to their former family are not merely viewed as legal duties, but rather as persistent, aggravating reminders of a past life that they wish to completely erase. The monthly transfer of funds can be perceived by a hostile individual as a direct threat to their own financial security and personal dominance within the household. When this economic resentment is coupled with the prospect of gaining full custody of the children, which would not only eliminate the child support obligation, but also unlock federal survivor benefits, the financial incentive for a permanent, albeit horrific, resolution becomes a powerful driver for an unscrupulous mind. Sociologists also note that these crimes are frequently catalyzed by a profound lack of empathy and an overwhelming desire for total control. The instigator of such a conspiracy often exhibits traits of extreme narcissism, viewing other human beings not as individuals they keep a hot inherent worth, but rather as obstacles to be removed or chess pieces to be manipulated. In their minds, the victim is reduced to a simple nuisance whose existence complicates their domestic harmony or financial aspirations. This total dehumanization of the victim allows the perpetrator to plan and execute a highly complex conspiracy with a chilling level of detachment. They convince themselves that they can orchestrate the perfect crime by outsourcing the physical act to a third party, thereby maintaining their ove kepno, clean hands, and an airtight alibi. This reliance on a proxy, however, is precisely where their pseudo-sophistication begins to unravel, as it introduces a level of exposure that almost always guarantees their eventual downfall. When analyzing the sophistication of such criminals, it quickly becomes apparent that their plans are characterized by a striking combination of elaborate staging and profound ignorance of basic forensic science and human behavior. The perpetrator, who attempts to stage a scene as a self-inflicted tragedy, usually relies on highly superficial tropes. They place pharmaceutical bottles nearby, leave a personal journal open to passages of sorrow, and arrange the environment in a manner that they believe perfectly mimics depression. In doing so, they almost always make the fatal mistake of overstaging. To an experienced investigator, a scene that is too tidy, where the clothes are folded vikep, at unnatural precision, beside the location of a tragedy, and where every piece of evidence practically begs to be noticed, immediately raises red flags. Genuine human crises are rarely so orderly. The very neatness that the criminal relies on to project a convincing narrative of suicide instead serves as a glaring indicator of human intervention. Furthermore, these individuals consistently underestimate the depth of modern forensic pathology and the physiological realities of the human body. The belief that one can easily simulate an accidental or self-inflicted drowning in a shallow body of water is a prime example of this scientific ignorance. The human body possesses highly powerful, involuntary survival mechanisms that cannot simply be turned off by conscious will. A conscious individual cannot easily force themselves to drown in a few inches of water, as the respiratory reflexes will inevitably force the person to struggle, gasp, and fight for air. When a forensic pathologist examines a body recovered from such a setting, the presence or absence of specific physiological markers, such as the degree of pulmonary froth, the presence of subtle defensive abrasions, and the exact positioning of the limbs, will immediately tell a story that completely contradicts the staged narrative. The criminal logic fails to comprehend that the physical body leaves an incredibly detailed record of its final moments, a record that cannot be erased by folding a pile of clothes or leaving a sad note on a table. The primary details and clues that law enforcement officers rely upon to crack these cases often begin with these very physical anomalies. An observant patrol officer or investigator at the scene will look past the obvious, staged elements and focus on the quiet inconsistencies. For example, a minor bruise in an unusual location, such as the lower leg or ankle, can suggest that the individual was held or moved while incapacitated. A small abrasion on the bridge of the nose or around the mouth can indicate the forceful application of a restraint or a smothering device. Additionally, the presence of minor property damage, such as a cracked picture frame or a slightly displaced piece of furniture, suggests a struggle that the perpetrators tried, but failed, to completely clean up. These tiny physical anomalies are the loose threads that, when pulled by a dedicated detective, eventually cause the entire tapestry of deception to fall apart. Beyond the physical evidence at the scene, investigators heavily rely on the behavioral patterns of the suspects and the complex web of human relationships. A sudden change in the custody dynamic, a history of escalating legal and personal harassment, and a highly hostile relationship between the current spouse and the former spouse immediately establish a clear circle of suspicion. In the digital and telephonic age, the record of communication becomes an absolute goldmine for the prosecution. Criminals, despite their self-proclaimed sophistication, almost always leave a highly traceable trail of phone calls, messages, and financial transactions. Even before the advent of modern smartphones, the simple analysis of landline toll records and call logs was capable of revealing highly unusual patterns of communication between individuals who outwardly claimed to have no association whatsoever. When a suspicious individual is found to be in frequent late-night contact with a known criminal element or a middleman, shortly before a tragedy occurs, the narrative of an accidental death or a self-inflicted tragedy quickly loses all credibility. Perhaps the most critical tool in the arsenal of law enforcement, however, is the leverage obtained through the perpetrator's own criminal associations. When a conspiracy involves multiple individuals, such as an instigator, a middleman, and a hired hand, the likelihood of a leak increases exponentially. Each person added to a conspiracy represents a massive vulnerability. Sooner or later, a dispute over money, a separate criminal investigation, or the sheer weight of self-preservation will motivate one of the co-conspirators to speak to the authorities. When an individual involved in a separate illegal enterprise faces significant legal jeopardy, they will almost always seek to trade information for leniency or protection. If that information includes highly specific, non-public details about a staged tragedy, such as the existence of a broken picture frame that was never reported in the news, the credibility of the informant is instantly established, providing law enforcement with the definitive breakthrough they need to secure search warrants and wiretaps. Drawing profound life lessons from these tragic occurrences is essential if society is to prevent such events in the future. The first and most vital lesson is the absolute importance of taking personal security and expressions of fear seriously. In many domestic homicide cases, the victim has expressed a clear, ongoing sense of unease or outright danger to their loved ones prior to the event. These warnings are sometimes dismissed by well-meaning friends and family members as mere anxiety or exaggeration stemming from a difficult divorce. It is imperative that as a community we learn to listen vekep, itehat, deep empathy, and take proactive steps when someone states that they do not feel safe, documenting instances of harassment, changing locks, installing security systems, and maintaining close, daily contact with a support network can create a critical barrier of safety around a vulnerable individual. Another profound lesson involves the legal and societal systems that govern family transitions. The process of divorce and custody allocation must be handled with the utmost professionalism, and any signs of escalating hostility or harassment must be addressed immediately by the courts. When a parent uses the legal system not to protect the best interests of the children, but rather as a tool of psychological warfare and economic ruin against their former partner, the risk of physical escalation increases dramatically. Mediation and legal oversight must remain highly vigilant, recognizing that financial disputes are often the primary warning signs of a much more dangerous underlying hostility. The community must also work to remove the social stigmas that sometimes prevent individuals from seeking help, whether they are dealing with the emotional fallout of a relationship or facing threats from an aggressive ex-spouse and their new partner. To assist law enforcement in catching perpetrators of such complex crimes much faster, several key experiences and systemic improvements can be highlighted. First and foremost is the critical need for independent, rigorous forensic oversight at the very beginning of any suspicious death investigation. A common loophole in many early investigations is the hasty determination of suicide or accidental death by a local coroner who may lack advanced medical training or who may be overly influenced by the superficial appearance of the scene. Establishing a standardized protocol where any unexpected death in a domestic setting is treated as a potential homicide until scientifically proven otherwise is essential. This prevents the loss of vital physical evidence and ensures that comprehensive autopsies, toxicological screenings, and crime scene photographs are secured immediately. Furthermore, the rapid integration of multi-jurisdictional intelligence is of paramount importance. Local police departments must maintain seamless communication channels with federal agencies, such as the Federal Bureau of Investigation, as well as state-level investigators. Often, a crucial piece of information regarding a suspect or an active hitman is sitting in a federal database or being discussed in an unrelated narcotics investigation in a neighboring county. By implementing advanced data sharing systems and fostering a collaborative culture where information is actively pushed to local detectives, the timeline for solving these cases can be shortened from months to days. Finally, the early utilization of specialized outside consultants, such as nationally recognized forensic pathologists and behavioral analysts, can provide local departments with the precise expertise needed to counter the staged defenses of sophisticated criminals, ensuring that justice is served swiftly and decisively. To fully appreciate the triumph of justice over such calculated malice, it is valuable to examine the detailed chronology of the historic investigation that took place in the state of Mississippi during the early part of the decade of the 1990s. The story began on a quiet, warm Sunday afternoon on May 24, 1992, in the city of Jackson. The sun was beginning its slow descent as Richard Mosby and his second wife, Deborah Mosby, drove toward the modest home of Richard S.'s former wife, Gail Petkovzak Mosby. In the back of the vehicle sat Richard and Gail's two young sons, Bill and Joseph, who were 7 and 9 years of age, respectively. The boys had spent the weekend with their father and stepmother, a routine custody arrangement that was supposed to conclude with a standard, peaceful drop-off at 5:00 in the afternoon. Upon arriving at the residence, the family walked up to the front entrance. The boys were eager to return to their mother, a dedicated and loving woman whose entire universe revolved around their well-being. However, when they knocked on the door, there was no response. This immediate lack of an answer was highly unusual, as Gail was an exceptionally responsible and punctual mother who always made sure she was home to welcome her children. The situation became even more perplexing when they discovered that the front door was firmly locked. According to the family, the door to the residence was almost never locked when Gail was inside, and her vehicle was clearly parked in the driveway, indicating that she had not left the property. Sensing that something was amiss, but unable to gain entry, Deborah Mosby wrote a brief note and left it on the windshield of Gail's car, while Richard requested that the next-door neighbor keep an eye on the house and contact them if any movement was seen. By 6:00 in the evening, the neighbor's concern had grown significantly. Knowing Gail's highly structured routine and her deep commitment to her sons, he knew there had to be an extraordinary reason for her absence. Possessing a spare key to the house, the neighbor decided to enter the home to conduct a welfare check. As he walked through the front door, the interior of the house appeared to be in perfect, immaculate order. This was entirely consistent with Gail's nature, as she was known to be an exceptionally neat and organized housekeeper. There were no obvious signs of a burglary, no overturned furniture, and no immediately visible indications of a struggle. The quiet stillness of the house was comforting at first, but as the neighbor moved deeper into the dwelling and approached the master bathroom, that comfort instantly dissolved into absolute horror. Inside the bathroom, the neighbor discovered the lifeless, unclothed body of Gail Mosby in her bathtub. Her épaulettes were hanging awkwardly over the edge of the tub, while her head was fully submerged beneath the shallow water. The shocking sight prompted an immediate, frantic call to the emergency number 911. Within minutes, local patrol officers and paramedics arrived at the scene. The initial assessment of the environment seemed to point toward a tragic, self-inflicted end. Beside the bathtub, Gail's clothing had been neatly and precisely folded, as if she had prepared for a normal bath. A search of the home revealed a personal journal containing entries that spoke of deep emotional pain and sadness following the difficult ending of a long-term relationship. Additionally, several prescription bottles for antidepressant medications were located in the residence, suggesting that she had been under medical care for depression. To many at the scene, including the local county coroner, these elements combined to present a straightforward, albeit deeply sad, case of suicide. The presence of the open journal, the prescription medications, and the lack of obvious forced entry or massive physical trauma on the body led to an early official ruling that Gail had died of accidental drowning or suicide. However, the initial patrol officers who secured the scene, including a highly experienced officer, possessed a deep professional intuition that refused to accept this convenient narrative. As the officer carefully examined the bathroom, several critical details began to stand out as highly inconsistent with a self-inflicted drowning. The first and most glaring anomaly was the depth of the water in the bathtub. The water was remarkably shallow, measuring only a few inches. The officer Kanoive kept from years of experience and basic human biology that the human body possesses incredibly powerful involuntary survival reflexes. A conscious person, even one suffering from severe emotional distress, cannot easily force themselves to drown in a shallow pool of water. Because the moment the respiratory system begins to intake water, the brain as survival mechanisms will trigger a violent, uncontrollable physical struggle to find air. The body will naturally fight to raise the head above water. For a person to drown in such shallow water without any signs of a massive struggle or defensive thrashing was highly improbable. Furthermore, the officer noticed a small amount of blood in the water and a distinct frothing around Gail's mouth. This frothing indicated that her lungs had engaged in a severe, desperate struggle for oxygen, a physiological reaction that suggested her airway had been blocked or compromised prior to her head being placed underwater. As the officer conducted a highly meticulous examination of the body, he also observed a very small, isolated bruise on the inside of her left ankle, as well as a minor abrasion on the bridge of her nose. These physical marks, though small and easily overlooked, suggested some form of physical restraint. Finally, as the lead homicide detective, Al Ledoux, arrived and began his sweep of the home, he noticed a framed photograph resting on a nearby surface. Upon closer inspection, the glass covering the photograph was cracked. This single broken item in an otherwise perfectly ordered home suggested a brief, localized struggle that had been hastily cleaned up. Despite the strong gut feelings of Detective Ledoux and the patrol officers, who believed the scene had been artificially staged to mimic a suicide, they faced a significant administrative roadblock. The county coroner remained firmly entrenched in his initial assessment, refusing to alter his ruling of accidental drowning or suicide. In the face of this official determination, and without any direct evidence of an intruder or a specific suspect, the detectives were unable to immediately launch a full-scale homicide prosecution. However, refusing to let the matter drop, they officially recorded the case as a death-pending investigation, leaving the legal door wide open for future inquiries if new evidence should arise. To understand the tragedy of Gail's death, it is important to reflect on the remarkable life she had lived. Born on September 13, 1952, in the historic city of Natchez, Mississippi, Gail Petkovczak was raised in a warm, deeply devout Catholic household. She was the eldest of 3 daughters born to Frank and Jackie Petkovczak, growing up alongside her sisters, Lisa and Jackie. Gail was described by her family as an exceptionally studious, highly intelligent young woman who graduated as the salutatorian of her high school class. Driven by a deep desire to care for others, she attended Northwestern to study nursing, eventually establishing a highly successful career as a neonatal intensive care unit nurse in Jackson. In this professional role, she spent her days tending to the most fragile, vulnerable newborns, earning the deep respect and admiration of her colleagues for her immense patience and gentle nature. By her late 20s, Gail was eager to build a family of her own. She was introduced to Richard Mosby, a man known for his happy, smiley disposition, by a mutual friend. After a brief and warm courtship, the couple married in the year 1981. They welcomed their first son, Bill, in 1982, followed by their second son, Joseph, in 1985. To support their family, Richard established a tire business in Hammond, Louisiana, where the family initially settled. While Gail continued her dedicated work as a nurse, the economic realities of running a business began to take a severe toll. The tire business unfortunately failed, placing a massive financial strain on the marriage. The economic pressure and growing domestic friction eventually led to their divorce in the year 1986. Following the dissolution of the marriage, Gail was awarded full custody of the two boys, while Richard was granted visitation every other weekend. Despite the separation, the initial years post-divorce were remarkably amicable. Gail and Richard co-parented their sons with a high degree of cooperation and mutual respect. However, this peaceful dynamic underwent a dramatic, highly toxic shift when Richard remarried a woman named Deborah. Deborah had been married previously and had experienced significant personal tragedies, including the loss of an infant child. After marrying Richard in the year 1988, they had a daughter together named Sarah. With Deborah's entry into the family, the atmosphere transformed from cooperative to highly hostile. Deborah exhibited an intense, deeply irrational resentment toward Gail. She despised the fact that Gail chose to retain the surname of Mosby, despite Gail's simple explanation that she wished to share the same last name as her two young sons. Furthermore, Deborah strongly resented the monthly child support payments that Richard was legally obligated to pay to Gail, viewing this financial support as a direct drain on her own household's resources. Under Deborah's influence, Richard's relationship with Gail deteriorated rapidly, resulting in continuous, exhausting court battles over custody, alimony, and child support. The boys quickly felt the stark difference between the warm, loving environment of their mother's home and the cold, neglectful atmosphere of their father and stepmother's household, where they were treated as secondary to their half-sister. The hostility directed toward Gail escalated to the point of absurdity. On several occasions, Gail experienced strange, targeted harassment, such as having her household utilities mysteriously cut off without explanation. The tension became so severe that it contributed directly to the ending of a long-term relationship Gail had been pursuing, as the constant drama and harassment proved too much to bear. 2 weeks prior to her death, a highly worried Gail called her sister Lisa, expressing a deep, pressing fear that her safety was in jeopardy. Although her sister tried to offer reassurance, the conversation was cut short, leaving a lingering sense of dread that would prove tragically prophetic. For 4 months following the discovery of Gail's body, the investigation remained stalled, with the official records designating the death as a suicide. However, the breakthrough that would completely blow the case open occurred in September of 1992 on a quiet Sunday afternoon. A woman named Vicki Mordecai entered the local office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, visibly terrified and seeking protection. Vicki and her husband, Ricky Mordecai, had been involved in an illegal marijuana cultivation operation in northeast Mississippi alongside Vicki's stepfather, a man named Roy Kyle. Following the sudden disappearance of a significant portion of the crop, Roy Kyle had accused the couple of theft and had issued severe threats against their lives. Vicki explained to the federal agents that she was in absolute terror because she knew her stepfather was highly capable of violence. To validate her fear, she revealed a shocking secret. Her stepfather had recently helped arrange the murder of a woman in Jackson, Mississippi, who had been found dead in her bathtub. Vicky proceeded to describe highly specific details of the crime scene that had never been released to the public, including the fact that a glass picture frame had been broken during the physical struggle inside the home. When the federal agents contacted the Jackson Police Department Homicide Division, Detective Ledoux and his team immediately recognized the significance of the broken glass. It was a detail kept strictly confidential by the investigators, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that Vicky's information was authentic. During subsequent interviews with homicide detectives, Vicky revealed the entire complex conspiracy. She explained that her sister, Deborah Mosby, had approached their stepfather, Roy Kyle, stating a clear, desperate need to have Gail taken care of. Roy Kyle had agreed to assist and put Deborah in contact with a known criminal element, a hitman named Billy Ray Ford, who had a history of violent offenses. An agreement was reached where Ford would be paid the sum of $5,000 to eliminate Gail. On the night of the crime, Billy Ray Ford and Richard Mosby drove to Gail's residence. Because Gail was on amicable terms with her ex-husband, she opened the door without hesitation, unaware that Ford was lurking nearby. Once inside, Ford launched a physical assault, during which the picture frame was shattered. Gail was incapacitated, and her unconscious body was placed in the bathtub to simulate a drowning, with the perpetrators carefully arranging the medication bottles and the journal to create the illusion of a self-inflicted tragedy. Armed with this extraordinary information, detectives sought to secure direct, recorded evidence of the conspiracy. They requested that Ricky and Vicky Mordecai wear hidden recording devices and visit the residence of Richard and Deborah Mosby. Under the pretense of being terrified of Billy Ray Ford, the Mordecays engaged Deborah in conversation, asking her to intervene and stop the hitman from coming after them. While Deborah denied hiring Ford to specifically commit murder, claiming instead that she had only hired him to rough Gail up or scare her into leaving them alone, her recorded statements clearly established that she knew the hitman and had actively placed him in contact with her husband. Following the sting operation, investigators subpoenaed Deborah's long-distance telephone records. The logs revealed a highly incriminating pattern of communication. During the month leading up to the tragedy, calls were placed from Deborah's phone to her stepfather, Roy Kyle, who would then immediately call Billy Ray Ford, who would then call Deborah back. This circular chain of communication, occurring between individuals who had no legitimate social or business connections, provided the prosecution with powerful circumstantial evidence of a coordinated conspiracy. In addition, investigators uncovered a chilling detail from Deborah's past. Her former husband, Mike McLean, contacted authorities to reveal that in the year 1988, a young child under Deborah's care had drowned in a bathtub under highly suspicious circumstances, a tragedy for which Deborah had attempted to escape responsibility. With the mounting evidence of conspiracy, grand jury indictments were secured, and Richard Mosby, Deborah Mosby, and Billy Ray Ford were arrested. While the legal process moved forward, a major custody battle ensued over Gail's two sons, who had temporarily been placed in the care of Richard and Deborah. Gail's devoted parents, Frank and Jackie, fought tirelessly in court, eventually securing full custody of the boys and relocating them to the safety of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where they could finally experience a sense of normalcy and peace. To overcome the coroner's persistent refusal to rule the death a homicide, the prosecution took the dramatic step of obtaining a legal order to have Gail's body exhumed. They retained the services of the highly acclaimed forensic pathologist, Dr. Michael Baden, to conduct a comprehensive independent autopsy. Upon reviewing the original crime scene photographs and examining the physical remains, Dr. Baden immediately identified the critical biological indicators of homicide. He pointed out that the small, isolated bruise on Gail S.'s ankle was entirely consistent with her being lifted by her legs while unconscious and lowered into the water. The abrasions on her nose indicated that a cloth or restraint had been forcefully held over her airway to render her unconscious before she was placed in the tub. Dr. Baden firmly concluded that Gail's death was a homicide, reinforcing the original assessment of the intuitive patrol officers. The joint trial for conspiracy to commit capital murder began on October 10, 1994. Facing the overwhelming evidence assembled by the state, the hitman, Billy Ray Ford, chose to enter a guilty plea to conspiracy to commit murder and agreed to testify against his co-conspirators. In May of 1995, as his own trial approached, Richard Mosby also chose to plead guilty to murder, removing the prospect of the death penalty and receiving a life sentence. The prosecution then turned its full attention to the mastermind, Deborah Mosby, whom they characterized as the driving force of the entire malicious plot. During Deborah's trial in December of 1995, the state presented a compelling case detailing her intense jealousy, her desire to avoid child support, and her plan to claim the children as federal survivor benefits, which amounted to approximately $1,300 per month. Backed by the expert testimony of Dr. Baden and the direct statements of the co-conspirators, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all charges. While they were unable to reach a unanimous decision on the death penalty, Deborah was sentenced to serve a life term in prison. The passage of time eventually saw the release of Billy Ray Ford and Richard Mosby in the year 2007, followed by Deborah S. release in the year 2021. While the release of those responsible for such a profound tragedy brought a difficult emotional challenge to Gail S.'s family, the legacy of her love remained entirely unbroken. Raised by their devoted grandparents, Bill and Joseph grew into successful, resilient adults who carried their mother's deep commitment to family into their own lives. Through their strength, the victory of goodness and the enduring power of maternal love were forever preserved, serving as a profound testament to the ultimate triumph of justice and human resilience.